For this session, I'd like to talk a little bit about one of three patterns of racial oppression or race relations. The specific pattern I'd like to talk about tonight is the paternalistic pattern. We will also talk a little bit about rigid competitive systems and fluid competitive systems in subsequent videos, but for right now, let's just talk about paternalistic systems of racial oppression. Um, a paternalistic pattern of racial oppression is usually found in agricultural or pre-industrial societies. It is typically it's going to take the form of a racial caste system. So I want to talk about sort of the features. I want to give you maybe an example or two, and talk about specifically the way in which this pattern varies across 5 different dimensions. And I'll do this for each of the other 2 systems as well. So we're going to look at the way in which paternalism or paternalistic systems operate with regard to stratification, what we see with regard to relative group size, what we see in terms of the division of labor, which is basically just a set of interrelated specialized tasks within a social structure, right? How does a society take a broad set of tasks or goals and divide up the responsibility for parts of that task so that the entire task gets done? And of course, then we also want to look at the way in which paternalistic systems of racial oppression look when it comes to racial interaction. And then finally, of course, the degree to which there is value consensus or value conflict. So whether these systems feature the tensions and conflicts sort of in a outward sort of obvious way, or if they're masked or hidden or play out in different fashions. So let's start with stratification. As I mentioned, the paternalistic pattern of racial oppression is found mostly in agrarian and pre-industrial societies. These are fairly rigidly stratified societies. So we would say that stratification in paternalistic systems is largely reflective of a closed system. Closed system, as I talked about last time, is a system in which there is no social mobility. People do not move up, people do not move down, right, or in any other way within the overall structure of the strata, of the layers of that society. The stratification then, in our case, would take the form of a caste system, specifically a racial caste system, in which one's racial or ethnic group membership is the thing that determines your position within the stratification system. Probably for our purposes, the most immediate example of this would be antebellum slavery in America. So antebellum just means before the Civil War, for those who don't know that term. So basically from 1619 until 1865, especially after 1705, 1715, sort of in that area as we make a transition away from indentured servitude involving both whites and blacks to a system of chattel slavery, which is exclusively applied to African labor. So broadest window in which this system exists would be 1619 to 1865. The more narrow but much more unambiguous racial caste system would be chattel slavery, race-based chattel slavery beginning in the early 1700s and enduring until 1865. So if you're looking for an example of a paternalistic system or paternalistic pattern of racial oppression, that would be probably our most obvious go-to example. So when it comes to relative group size, the dominant group under a paternalistic system of racial oppression, the dominant group is almost always going to be the numerical minority, right? So when we look at apartheid era South Africa, 25 million blacks, 5 million whites, right? The dominant group is the smaller group. Again, just a callback to something we talked about earlier in the semester, it sort of makes a mockery of our use of the terms majority and minority. When we look at antebellum slavery especially in the United States, but even in the late stages of the British American colonies, the slave laborers vastly outnumber the people who own plantations, and even freed whites who were just farmers or laborers but didn't own slaves themselves. So that was a relatively small group of people relative to the number of people who were being sort of systematically oppressed within this racial caste system of race-based chattel slavery. The division of labor under a paternalistic pattern of racial oppression is, not surprisingly, organized by race. Laborers, especially agrarian laborers, were of African descent. They were enslaved. It's a fairly simple division of labor, especially in the South, in the agrarian South of the British American colonies and then the United States. We're looking at a relatively simple technological system of production, right? We hadn't really seen at that point the sort of technological innovations that would revolutionize agriculture that'll come along later. So this is a very labor-intensive but fairly straightforward division of labor in the agrarian South. In the industrial North, it's a little bit different. One, we don't see chattel slavery, especially after the first couple decades of the foundation of the United States. Chattel slavery is almost exclusively a feature of southern states. But in the industrial North, the economy also features a division of labor, but it's much more complex. It's not grounded in a really simple division of labor because you have a significant number of freed blacks sort of within the population, leavened throughout the population. Northern industries, especially textiles and other kinds of processing and manufacturing industries, are very heavily dependent on the inexpensive raw materials that are coming from the South. And of course, they're inexpensive coming from the South because they're being produced with labor that's not being paid, right? So Northern industries and a number of vested economic interests in the North are also heavily invested in and benefiting from chattel slavery, race-based chattel slavery in the agrarian South. So, in our historical narratives in the United States, it's often easy sometimes to paint the northern states as the forward-looking, pro-abolition, anti-slavery states, and the southern states in a kind of villainous role as the people who practice race-based enslavement. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. But when we're thinking specifically about the way that this paternalistic system is operating in the agrarian South, it's fairly easy to sort of see a simplistic and basic sort of division of labor. With regard to racial interaction, there is a lot of interaction between the dominant group and the subordinate group. This is not a place where there is a tremendous amount of segregation. So we talk about segregation, just so everyone is clear on what we're talking about here. We're talking about the separation of two or more groups into separate neighborhoods, separate schools, separate workplaces, etc. Right? So it's sort of two separate worlds. In the agrarian South, under this paternalistic system of racial oppression, the oppressor and the oppressed are kind of right there side by side, right? There's a lot of contact between the dominant group and the subordinate group, between the planter class and the slaves. Obviously, it's highly unequal, right? Slaves are still a subordinate group, even though they are in regular and frequent contact with members of the dominant group, right? They are being overseen by whites. They are being managed in the household by whites. They're being dealt with in the marketplaces where they're being purchased for transport back to the plantation and being put to work there. They're constantly interacting with members of the dominant group, and there's very little physical separation of the races, right? They're kind of right there side by side, shoulder to shoulder. As a result, the displays of domination and the displays of subordination take the form of kind of mannerisms, the way that one talks, not speaking until spoken to if you're enslaved, deferential, bowing your head, looking to the side, making room as people walk as white people walk past you, right? All of those kinds of overt displays of subordination and overt displays of dominance become very, very important in signaling, which group is the dominant group and which group is the subordinate group, because you can't sort of say, well, we don't have anything to do with, we're never even anywhere close to the people that are being subordinated. That's just simply not the case. So because these groups are in frequent contact, there's a tremendous amount of sort of presentation of domination or subordination in the interaction rituals that occur between these people. And again, a nice little interesting place where some degree of social psychology can kind of intrude on what is normally a kind of a little bit of a dry and sort of structural analysis. We can kind of see on an interpersonal level how those kinds of external conditions would shape how people behave toward one another in that instance. Finally, with regard to value consensus versus value conflict, under a paternalistic system of racial oppression, there isn't much of an outward appearance of conflict. Now, don't get me wrong, there is not consensus. The enslaved people don't like being enslaved. The dominant group, as much as they like to talk about the people under their, under their sort of domination, in kindly fashion sometimes, will never let people forget who the dominant group is and who the subordinate group is. But because there isn't a lot of outward conflict between the dominant group and the subordinate group, there's an appearance of consensus on a lot of issues, but that is, again, it's just a surface level kind of conformity and consensus, right? It's the result of a forced conformity, right? If somebody doesn't sort of give into and conform their behavior to the expectations of this particular pattern of racial oppression, they'll be harshly punished, right? And knowing that they'll be harshly punished leads people to diminish the degree of sort of verbal or other forms of resistance that they might otherwise want to engage in. So the apparent complacency, the apparent value consensus that exists between the dominant group and the subordinate group is just that. It's just kind of a veneer. It's a surface level phenomenon that gets sort of easily revealed as such when we begin to see slave uprisings, right? That if there were indeed actual consensus, the population of enslaved people would be much easier to manage. But there's all kinds of resistance, all the way from people losing their tools or working slowly or feigning illness, all the way up to actual outright slave uprisings. But in everyday kind of interactions, an outsider observing the behavior of these two different groups toward one another might assume that there's a great deal of agreement or consensus on the values that are held by both groups. So next time we'll talk a little bit about competitive race relations, and there are two sort of patterns of competitive race relations. One is a rigid competitive, and the other is what we call a fluid competitive. I'll do a video for each of those separately and kind of again walk across the 5 different dimensions along which these patterns vary and kind of dig in and give you some more details and again maybe a couple of examples. So until then, take care.